marionette is a puppet that's controlled from above by pulling on strings attached to its limbs. In other words, you can animate the puppet by tugging on its strings. You can do the same thing in After Effects by using the puppet tools. However, instead of strings, you'll use pins. What happens is that the puppet effect will deform part of your image based on where you place the pins. Those pins determine which part of the image moves and which do not. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use puppet tools, including how to use deform pins, mark overlap areas on the puppet, specify areas that don't move on the puppet, animate the puppet, and use the puppet sketch tool. Where you place the deform pins will determine how an object moves on the screen, so placing the deform pins becomes an important part of the puppet effect, but also becomes a strategy. Placing the deform pins is also the first step in creating a puppet effect. Let's start by placing deform pins for our composition. Start out by clicking on the puppet pin tool in the Tools panel. Now click on the first area in your object that you want to be able to move. We're going to click the wrist. The puppet pin is a yellow dot on our composition. Now let's add another pin on the other wrist. We're also going to add a few more. When you're finished adding pins, go to the timeline. Click on the triangle beside Mesh 1 to expand it. Then click the triangle beside Deform to expand its properties. It'll be helpful as we move along if you rename the pin so you know where each one is in the composition. To rename a pin, select it, press Enter, and then type in a new name. When you're finished, put a check mark beside Show in the Tools panel. This will show you the distortion mesh. Your composition should look like this. Now look at the triangle's value in the Tools panel. If you increase the value, the animation will be smoother. However, your video will take longer to render. You can also extend the mesh. Right now, the expansion value is at 3. You would do this to include a stroke in the deformation. Just for a minute, imagine your best friend is standing on the opposite side of the gymnasium. As they start to walk toward you, their legs move and their arms swing. You stand there and watch them walking toward you. Pay special attention to their arms and legs. You'll notice that as they walk, there are times where you won't see their arm or all of their leg because they'll be behind other parts of their body. To animate this in After Effects, you'll use the Puppet Overlap tool. It's grouped with the Puppet Pin tool. After you select the Puppet Overlap tool, make sure that Show is selected in the Tools panel. If you need to, zoom in on the composition so that you can see the legs and torso of your puppet. Then go back to the Tools panel and change In Front to 100%. What this does is hide anything that is overlapped from showing. You'll only see what is up front. Now let's go to the mesh in the composition. Click on points in the mesh to define areas that should stay in front. The Puppet Starch tool gives you pins to place that determine which parts of the area stay rigid and are not distorted as much. You'll use the Puppet Starch tool to define the areas that you don't want to have the same amount of motion as other areas do. For example, perhaps the puppet's right arm doesn't move as much as the left, or maybe barely at all. You would use the Puppet Starch tool to define this area. Let me show you what I mean. Click on the Puppet Starch tool. It's grouped with the Puppet Pin tool. Make sure Show is checked in the Tools panel so you can see the distortion mesh. Now place pins on the area that you want to stiffen. Now that all the pins are in place, it's time to do the animation. This is the fun part. To animate it, select the layer in the Timeline panel and press U so you can see all of the keyframes for that layer. Next, change the position of the deform pins. Create more keyframes to further animate the pins. Adding keyframes and changing the position property in order to animate the puppet can be a lot of work. It can also be very time-consuming. To save time, you can use the Puppet Sketch tool. The Puppet Sketch tool allows you to drag the objects into position. After Effects records the animation as you drag the pins. Use the Puppet Sketch tool by having the Puppet Pin tool active and select the puppet in the Timeline panel. Then select a pin in the Composition panel and press Ctrl or Command. This activates the Puppet Sketch tool and you'll see a stopwatch appear next to the cursor. Be sure to continue to press Ctrl or Command as you drag the pin to a new position. Release the mouse when you're finished. Repeat these steps for other pins.